Hi, and welcome to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. Thank you for checking out our podcast. Established in 1935, we're an American-owned and family-owned independent seed company. And we're excited to partner with you in our new podcast by bringing you 5 generations of agricultural experience and decades of industry expertise. In our podcasts, you can expect to gain valuable and timely information to aid you in making decisions for your operation. We'll keep things simple and informative, and much like our motto, Planet Profit. Welcome back to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. I'm Juan Camacho, Cornelius Seed Innovation Lead, and I'm joined by Craig Allaman, our lead agronomist. In today's episode, we're going to talk about uneven corn stands and early season drought stress for corn. It's a timely topic given the stage of planting we're in, but before we move on to that, Craig, about a month ago, we were talking about planting into cool weather and things to watch out for. Since that conversation, bring us forward to the Mother's Day weekend, certain counties saw weather 25 degrees and below sustained for a few hours, even some tomato plants getting damaged. What I want to start off and just to jump right into is, did it appear as if any of that damage that could have happened during those freeze events, if any of that will be sustained throughout the year? What are your thoughts, and can you give us a little update on some of your travels?
Yeah, so we'll take everybody back a little bit to what we ran into there after Mother's Day weekend. And it's almost uncanny anymore. It seems like that's when we're going to have a cold snap each year, and this year was no different. I did get a call from Southwest Wisconsin. They had on Sunday night, Monday morning, they got down to 25 degrees for probably a 3 to 4 hour time period. And then the following night, Monday night, Tuesday morning, they got down to 27 for a 3 to 4 hour time period. And we would consider that to be pretty touch and go, and have potential to do some pretty major injury to emerged crops. Soybeans more than corn will injure emerged corn then, but most of our corn was maybe in the V1 stage, and the growing point is going to be well below the ground. So even if we would freeze off the tissue that's exposed, that plant's just going to continue to grow out the top because that growing point is well protected in the soil. But with a soybean plant, of course, our growing point is always at the top of the plant, our main growing point. And then at every node, we have axillary buds that can also be activated if we have injury at the top of the plant, and go ahead and take off and grow from there. So all that is exposed in the air. And so when I heard of those temperatures there, knowing how early that we had planted up there in that part of the world compared to normal, I was definitely concerned. We had beans planted up there plenty of time to be out of the ground and fully exposed. So Thursday of that week, that should have been enough time, 48, 72 hours after you've had that kind of a freeze, you should be able to see, what your damage is going to be like. Fortunately, what I found, a couple of fields that I looked at had emerged. The bulk of fields had not, and it's been pretty dry in the North Country, and that was definitely working in our favor. I think plenty of those soybeans that were planted early were in drier soil, and they just and cooler because it's been cool even previous to that we just didn't have real quick emergence. And the ones that were out of the ground, they had just got out of the surface of the soil. The cotyledons in most cases were probably still shut completely. So there was, some pretty good protection. A soybean plant produces, for lack of a better term, its own antifreeze type substance that protects that young plant. So that's why we say you really need to get down to 28 degrees for extended period of time to be really in jeopardy with those early beans. So it gives us some good protection and some leeway there. And
so I'm sorry, just that am I hearing this right? That slow emergence was actually our friend this time around. Yeah,
we always complain about slow emergence. It definitely was our friend. When I knowing how early they planted, when I heard those temps, I thought, we've got a problem on our hands here. And there just really weren't many fields that had emerged. Some of them were just starting to crack, that you could see the necks on those beans. But that played into our favor. Those cotyledons being closed up yet on the newly emerged ones were protecting those first leaves. And so I saw some damage on some cotyledons and maybe even some leaf damage, but really fairly minor, and certainly nothing to worry about, since soybeans, they have a great flexibility in population, and they'll compensate by bushing out if there's some damage. So that's a good deal. And something that we consider agronomically not good. Slow emergence actually probably saved us there. So
happy to hear. I mean, soybeans being relatively well protected, for lack of a better word, given where they were in their stage of emerging. It's a good segue for us to move into corn, and I think right now we're at that part of the season where it's inevitable that we might see some uneven corn stands, right? And naturally, with those uneven corn stands, the topic or the conversation moves to replant. And I guess I don't want to focus it too heavy on the replant piece, because that's an individual decision there. But what can you tell us about what we're seeing for uneven corn, and what should we be watching out for?
Yeah, and we'll have uneven corn somewhere in the footprint that we cover. Western Illinois, eastern part of Iowa, southern part of Minnesota, and southwest Wisconsin. We're going to see that somewhere every year, and it can be for varying reasons. A lot of times, it's cold, wet that really gets us. A lot of cases this year it was cold, dry, because that whole northern part of Iowa, northern Illinois, Wisconsin area, very, very dry in the spring, to the point where there were crops no doubt planted in some dry soil, or soil that was not very consistent. You might have had some in dry soil, and right next to it, its neighbor might have had enough moisture to go ahead and germinate. So some of that unevenness, or a lot of that unevenness, was probably just due to some of the plants didn't absorb enough water to initiate that germination process. And then when they did, if they did finally catch a rain, then they went ahead and emerged and came out. So that's better than if we're cold and wet and we get a bunch of disease in there, like a pythium, or a fusarium, or rhizoctonia, and we've actually harmed that plant, hurt that root system, had that root system full of disease, and that's the reason why it's slow to emerge. When we see that happen, that plant never fully recovers. It's going to carry that that compromised root system through the whole season. And then a lot of times we'll see barren plants because of that, or plants with the nubbin ears and things like that. If we just have late emergers because it was dry, then that plant coming out of the ground still with a healthy root system has a lot better opportunity to contribute to the yield. So I'm not too awfully worried about that. I mean, studies will show uneven emergence, replant on that, and usually never pays. You got to remember you're always later in the year, and just your calendar date's just against you, even if you replant. So but this year, I feel pretty good about the uneven emergence. 2019, a lot of the uneven emergers were just never amounted to a lot. We were so cold and so wet for so long. But this year, not so bad.
Okay, that's good to see and hear, definitely. You mentioned studies reference. I think one of the things I do want to mention is that some of the information that we're talking about today is covered in great detail in a mailer we send out called Solutions for Your Fields. And I want to invite people to visit our website, going to www.corneliusseed.com. If you scroll down to the contact us section, just send us a little message, and we can add you to our mailer, and you can receive some timely and very valuable information that Craig reviews and comments on at times. Things like corn disease calendars and soybean disease calendars, and a lot of other topics. But at any rate, I just wanted a chance to plug that in there, Craig. I think I recall in one of the last ones reading in there that if conditions existed that the emergence of more than half of the corn stand plants is delayed by a few weeks or so. That is then when people can see that yield potential being reduced and maybe justifying a little bit of the replant. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And we'll touch on the highlights on a lot of these things on the podcast, but the articles that we link to and everything on the emails, so you can really get into a lot more detail and just have it as a reference, put it in your own library and have it for future. So definitely a good thing. Just all you got to do is get us your email, and we won't by no means flood your email with unuseful information, but there is some pretty good stuff there that we'll send on as the season, whatever the season happens to give us, because every year's different.
That's definitely true. One last thing that came to mind on the uneven corn stand there. How can fields with uneven corn emergence be managed?
Well, there are a few watch outs. If you've got, if you're just talking, you're a few days behind or even a week, for the most part, everything will catch up. But if you've got 2-3 weeks delayed, the first thing you're going to need to watch out that's right around the corner here is when you're spraying your herbicides post applied on your corn. That each different herbicide has its own label as to what growth stage that you can spray on. Some you can spray too early. You're prohibited from spraying until it reaches, say, V2 or V3. So in a case like that, if you were spraying your older plants and your younger plants weren't in that window yet, then you could see some herbicide damage to them. So yeah, there are some things that you kind of need to manage, and that's probably one of the biggest ones that you need to watch out for.
Well, let's move on to early season drought stress in corn. It's safe to say that we have a varying conditions in terms of soil moisture across the Cornelius seed footprint. Some parts were really in need of moisture, and there's other parts that have plenty. For those areas that have been experiencing some of that early season drought, uh, what is some of that translate to into stress for corn? What can you tell us?
Yeah, in our footprint, really we're just talking the far southeast corner of Iowa and then western Illinois. Those are the only areas that really have had adequate moisture this spring. And I'm down here in western Illinois. We'll have to replant some of our historical wet holes. We've had that much moisture since planting, and our planting window was relatively small because we were wet early. So, but that's a really small area of what we deal with as a company. Most of our area has been pretty dry, some severely dry when you get out in north central Iowa in particular. And there's been some relief here over the last week here on some of these rains that consistently had kind of kept coming up from the Gulf. But those areas were so dry it won't take long for them to get back in that situation again. So we typically think of a drought, later in the season, or normal historical months that are dry. You get late July and the month of August. But we can do some damage with early season droughts as well. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. One of the things, when the corn seed first germinates, the seed itself is providing the energy for that plant to live, and puts out that initial root system, and that feeds the plant also for a while. But then the nodal roots start to take over at about V3, and by V6 they're feeding the entire plant. The seed's done. There's no more energy coming from there. So it's important to get those early nodal roots, those first 3-4 nodes, out, established in the ground and in the moisture, so they can feed that plant and anchor that plant as well. And the problem is roots will not grow in hot, dry soil. They'll hit that hot, dry soil, and they will literally stop growing, and eventually they'll die. And then then it's the next node that comes out that has to have that opportunity to get that plant anchored and get in the ground to feed and to water that plant. So that's some of the things we worry about in this really, really early season drought situation. And when we have that happen, we'll watch out for floppy corn syndrome is what that's called. And literally at some point, if those initial early nodal roots don't anchor in the soil, that corn will flop over. Sometimes even breaking the hypocotyl off, which is its lifeline to any roots below the nodal roots. So it could be a pretty serious situation. It's tough to recover from that. Shallow planting can cause that. If you don't get that seed planted at least 3/4 to an inch deep, it's hard for those nodal roots to establish because that crown is up so high. But what worried about right now is just the really dry conditions. And as we start getting warmer here, hot, dry winds and things like that, we're just going to have a tough time establishing those roots. So hoping we keep getting enough rains to get past that stage and get those nodal roots anchored into the ground.
So you'd say right now the biggest concern is below ground, right? I mean, I'm not hearing you say that there's a whole lot of concern yet and obviously not leaves, because there's not a whole lot of leaves out right now, but is it too soon to start talking about potential impact of like the ear length or the kernel row numbers?
Well, we're a little bit early on that side, but that'll be the next thing. Once we get past this, the worried about the roots and the floppy corn, when we get to that V5, so we've got 5 collared leaves, V5 to V8, that's when we're determining how many rows around on the ear. And a lot of hybrids nowadays are pretty determinate on the amount of kernels they're going to put around, but they will fluctuate if the environmental conditions are good. And an ear of corn always has even rows. So if it was going to put 18 rows on, let's say if that was its typical ear, but then we've got a real droughty situation or a herbicide injury or something like that, a lot of times it'll knock those potential rows around the ear down at this time of the year, or at that time of the year. We're still a week or two, probably away from that time period anyway. And of course that just reduces some of your yield potential. And then even later on than that, we're talking shoulder high corn, so 3rd week in June, something like that, when we're in that V12 to V15 stage. That's when we're determining how many kernels per row we got. So we determine rows around pretty early on, or let's say knee-high corn, and then later on we're determining those length rows. So those are 2 big determinations on potential yield. And then after that, of course, you got to pollinate and fill the kernels and everything else. But that's what early season drought will really nick us is ear size, both rows around and length. And so we really want to get some rain and kind of get by that time frame coming up here pretty shortly in a lot of the areas that we cover.
All right. Well, I'm hearing, watch out for floppy corn. And really that it's great to get that refresher and know that there's names to these. That the nodal roots are taking over as a dominant source to feed the corn plant there between that V3 and V6 stage you mentioned. Is there anything else that as we're walking fields and scouting that we need to keep an eye on?
Well, we talked about in our email, as you mentioned there last week, going to be rootworm season coming on us real shortly. And I'd mentioned in that email, the eggs hatch into the rootworm larva by growing degrees. That's kind of how we measured it. But a good rule of thumb, just because it happens at about the same time frame or the same amount of growing degrees, is when you start seeing lightning bugs at night. And that's about when your rootworm larvae are going to start hatching. And then, of course, feeding on the young roots of the corn plant. Up until about silking, tasseling time frame, when those larvae will turn into adults and come out as adult rootworm beetles and clip silks, and then lay eggs for next year. So and it's interesting because we put that email out, say mid last week, and over the weekend I was looking out after night and I saw 1 or 2 lightning bugs. So they just got started. And that means our larvae are just hatching out and getting ready to chow down on our corn roots. That makes it a good time over here the next couple of weeks or so to get out there and dig some of your roots in fields that you're concerned about. and see what kind of pressure that you have. See if your control mechanism, whether that was an insecticide that you applied or whether it is smart stack corn with rootworm traits in it, just to see how good that's doing as a control mechanism. And then also kind of have an indicator, or your first indicator, on what your pressure may be next year if you've got a lot of feeding that's come through.
Well, that's definitely a perfect way to close it, Craig. I think it, like you said, with that coming up and not being too soon to even start thinking about that fungicide application, that window just being over a month away, it's, as you've said lots and lots of times before, it's always a good idea to plan ahead and if you need to secure product and applicators. Those guys' schedules fill up too.
That's correct. Yep. And that's going to be one of our next big scouting windows once we get the weeds killed here pretty shortly, is we'll start looking for disease. Gray leaf spot's always a big one, but northern corn leaf blight, some tar spots, and some of the newer ones we've had in the last few years. And so, we get that third week in June, we'll start getting out there and seeing if we have any on the lower leaves on the plants. And it is a good idea if you think there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be spraying, to make sure you got those plans made ahead of time, because that everybody will get busy that time of the year.
Well, great. I think folks, you've heard us talk about a couple of times about an email we've referenced here on this podcast. So if you want to get a chance to be a recipient of that and be on our mailing list for solutions for your fields, go to our website and scroll to the bottom of the page and send us a note. And as Craig said, you will never receive any kind of spam or any of that kind of information that sometimes gives us headaches. This will be agronomic in nature. It will be timely, and even gives you a chance to interact with us should you have any questions. So, thanks again for tuning into our podcast. And as always, if you have any questions or want to continue the conversation or simply have any feedback, don't hesitate to get online and send us a message or give us a call. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of your week.